one document may have changed the future of Europe's money forever. After the Battle of Waterloo, Europe was desperate for stability. In the middle of financial chaos, one powerful banking family became linked to a bond that would fuel centuries of speculation, influence, and legend. But was it brilliant finance, or the beginning of one of history's greatest legends? On the 18th of June, 1815, two armies stood facing each other 9 miles south of Brussels. On one side, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, a man who had conquered most of continental Europe in under a decade, redrawn its map a dozen times, and placed his own brothers on the thrones of 3 kingdoms. On the other side, the Duke of Wellington, Britain's finest general. Behind him stood a coalition force assembled for one purpose, not to push Napoleon back, but to end him permanently, because Napoleon had already come back once. Exiled to Elba in 1814, given a tiny island kingdom, told history was finished with him. He had watched for 10 months, then sailed back to France with 1,000 soldiers. Troops sent to arrest him joined him. Marshals sent to stop him embraced him. The King of France fled Paris without a fight. This was the man Wellington was facing. The financial markets of London understood the stakes perfectly. British government bonds, consols, had been falling for weeks as Napoleon marched north. Every day without news meant more selling. Insurance rates tripled. Gold was hoarded. Credit tightened across every exchange in Europe. And standing at his usual position in the Royal Exchange, a 43-year-old German-born banker named Nathan Mayer Rothschild was watching all of it. Not because he was afraid, because he had already made his decision. He simply needed confirmation. Nathan Rothschild had built something no government in Europe possessed, a private intelligence network. A chain of couriers, boats, and agents that could move information across the continent faster than any official channel, faster than British military dispatches, faster than French intelligence. While kings waited days for news of their own armies, the Rothschilds waited hours. On the morning of June 19th, one full day before any official British communication reached London, a Rothschild courier stepped off a boat at Folkestone with a single report. Napoleon had been defeated, completely, irreversibly. Wellington had held his line through 9 hours of brutal fighting. The French Imperial Guard, men who had never broken in battle, had broken. Napoleon had fled the field. The war was over. Nathan Rothschild read the report, folded it, put it in his pocket, and went to the exchange. What happened in the next 48 hours would give his family a position over the financial architecture of Europe that no private entity had ever held before, and that no private entity has held since. Every serious trader in London watched Nathan Rothschild, not because they liked him, because he was almost always right. His positioning at his usual pillar near the exchange entrance had become a daily reference point, a leading indicator that the market trusted more than official government announcements. When Rothschild moved, experienced men moved with him. On the morning of June 19th, Nathan Rothschild began selling British consols, quietly, steadily, not one dramatic transaction, a consistent, patient sell across the morning. Consols were already depressed from weeks of uncertainty. The sight of Rothschild selling sent an immediate signal to every trader on the floor. Napoleon must have won. There was no other explanation. If Wellington had prevailed, consols would surge. British victory meant stability, meant the war debt was manageable, meant the government could service its obligations. Rothschild selling meant he knew something. And what he knew, the market concluded, was catastrophe. The selling spread. Traders who had been holding through the uncertainty dumped their positions. The price fell further, then faster. No official news came from the government because the government had no news yet. The market filled the silence with the only story that explained Rothschild's behavior: disaster, French victory, Napoleon restored. Consols fell to levels not seen since the darkest days of the war. Then, through a network of agents spread across the floor, Nathan Rothschild began buying, not in his own name, through intermediaries, through agents who appeared unconnected, placing orders that individually looked like opportunistic purchases of depressed securities. No single transaction was large enough to signal reversal, but collectively, steadily, over the hours before official news arrived, Rothschild was accumulating an enormous position in British government bonds at their lowest price in years. On June 21st, official dispatches reached London. Wellington had won. Napoleon was finished. Consols surged instantly. The panic reversed in hours. Investors who had sold in fear scrambled to buy back at prices far higher than they had sold. Nathan Rothschild's position, accumulated at the bottom, was now worth a multiple of what he had paid. Historians dispute the exact profit. Contemporary accounts range from £1 million to £40 million. The Rothschild archive has never confirmed a precise figure. What is confirmed is that the Waterloo trade was the single largest private accumulation of wealth in British financial history to that point. But the money was not the significant outcome. The significant outcome was what the British government concluded from watching it happen. Nathan Rothschild had moved capital faster than their own intelligence service could move information. He had financed the entire war effort without a single missed payment. He had demonstrated, in the most public way possible, that the Rothschild network was not merely a useful partner, it was indispensable, and indispensable partners are given different terms than ordinary contractors. In the 3 years following Waterloo, Europe needed to financially rebuild itself. 2 decades of near-continuous warfare had left every major government carrying debt that made their treasuries dysfunctional. France owed reparations. Britain needed to service its war bonds. Austria was technically insolvent. Prussia had borrowed beyond its capacity. New sovereign bond issuances were required across the entire continent simultaneously, and simultaneously meant one underwriter capable of managing flows between governments that were, in some cases, paying each other. There was only one such entity. In 1817, the British government appointed Nathan Rothschild sole underwriter for a £60 million government bond issuance, the largest single sovereign debt transaction in British history to that date. One family, £60 million, one placement. In 1818, James Rothschild in Paris arranged France's war reparations financing, structuring the bond issuance that allowed France to pay the coalition powers their indemnity. The French government, the Austrian government, the Prussian government, and the British government were all simultaneously party to transactions being managed by Rothschild brothers in their respective capitals. Nathan in London, James in Paris, Salomon in Vienna, Karl in Naples, Amschel in Frankfurt. 5 brothers, 5 capitals. Every major European government's debt passing through the same family simultaneously. This is what historians mean by the Rothschild bond system. Not a single secret document. A coordinated series of sovereign agreements that gave one family simultaneous financial relationships with powers that were, politically, often adversaries of each other. And because they structured the debt of every government, they understood every government's finances with a precision that the governments themselves could not match internally. The British Chancellor knew British finances. The Rothschilds knew everyone's. James Rothschild wrote to Nathan in 1818 with a directness that historians have quoted for 2 centuries. The family was not merely banking for governments. They were the mechanism through which governments functioned. Austria's Chancellor Metternich, the most powerful diplomat in Europe, architect of the entire post-Napoleonic order, acknowledged that European governments had rendered themselves so dependent on the Rothschild network that acting against the family's interests meant acting against their own financial stability. This was not flattery. It was an accurate description of the structural position the family now occupied. When the Greek War of Independence began in the 1820s, European powers considering intervention consulted the Rothschilds, not because they had armies, but because intervention required financing, and financing required their cooperation. When newly independent Latin American nations sought European capital, they went to the Rothschilds before approaching governments, because Rothschild underwriting was the gateway to European bond markets. The document that gave one family control of Europe's money was not forged or stolen. It was signed by governments who needed capital more than they needed independence from the people who had it. What the Rothschilds built after 1815 was not a conspiracy. It was something more durable, a system. A conspiracy requires secrecy, requires active concealment. The Rothschild bond system required none of this. It was conducted in public, documented in government records, reported in newspapers, and openly acknowledged by the political leaders who depended on it. It simply could not be replicated, because replicating it required 3 generations of capital accumulation, network building, and relationship management that no competitor could compress into a shorter timeline. By the 1820s, they had financed Brazilian independence. By the 1830s, they were funding railway construction across Britain, France, Austria, and Belgium. By the 1840s, they were restructuring sovereign debt across half a dozen governments simultaneously. By 1860, they were the largest banking house in the world, with no institution within a generation of their scale. In 1875, Prime Minister Disraeli needed £4 million by morning to purchase Britain's stake in the Suez Canal before France could acquire it. Parliament was in recess. No time for formal channels. He sent a message to Lionel de Rothschild, Nathan's son. Lionel asked what security the British government was offering. Disraeli said, "The British government." Lionel considered for a moment and said, "We will do it." £4 million, transferred the next morning. No parliamentary approval, no competing bids, one conversation. Britain held that Suez stake for 80 years. This is the legacy of 1815. Not the trade itself, but the position the trade confirmed. A position where one family was not an advisor, not a lender in the ordinary sense, but the mechanism through which European sovereign finance functioned. Remove them and the system seized. Governments understood this, and rational governments do not remove mechanisms that keep their systems running. Nathan Rothschild died in 1836. His Times obituary described him not primarily by his wealth, though it was unprecedented, but by the relationship he had permanently altered between private capital and sovereign power, a relationship that had never existed in that form before, and that changed how nations financed themselves from that point forward. The structure lasted over a century. The family remained primary underwriters of British sovereign debt until the First World War, when the scale of borrowing finally exceeded even their capacity, and Britain turned to J.P. Morgan in New York. Even their successors were working from the Rothschild blueprint. Mayer Rothschild, the Frankfurt coin dealer who started everything, reportedly said, He cared not who made a nation's laws, so long as he could control its money supply. Whether he said it or not, his 5 sons lived it across 5 capitals for 100 years. They did not seize Europe's financial system. They built it. Then they offered it to Europe's governments on terms those governments found they could not refuse. Waterloo lasted 9 hours. The bond that followed it lasted a century. Watch closely the next time someone tells you history is made by armies. Sometimes the most powerful person on the battlefield never fires a single shot. They just know the result first. The secret was never hidden. It was filed in government archives across 4 countries, signed by ministers who understood exactly what they were agreeing to. They signed because they had no choice. And that is how one family became the bankers of empires. The truth behind the 1815 bond is far more complex than the myths, and its legacy still shapes debates about power, finance, and history today.